The girls said, "My real mother is in the well." 15 years later they dug it and, hello everyone. Enjoy these few minutes of tranquility as you follow this story. It may move you or it may haunt you. But what is certain is that you will not be able to stop watching. The girl's name was Mila. She was only 6 years old when she looked at her teacher with glassy eyes and said, "My real mother is in the well." The room went silent. The children stopped playing. The teacher tried to laugh, thinking it was just her imagination. But there was something in Mila's voice, something that didn't seem like a joke. She repeated this often, always in the same way, always with the same empty look, as if she saw things that no one else could see. The adoptive parents were called to the school. They downplayed everything, laughed, said that their daughter was creative, a dreamer, that she made up stories all the time. But what no one knew was that Mila woke up almost every night in a cold sweat. She dreamed of a woman falling, and she always fell into a well, a deep, dark, silent well. And the most disturbing thing was what came before. A man was pushing this woman. His face was never clear. But Mila woke up with her heart racing, her body shaking. She felt that this woman was part of her, even without knowing who she was. Over time, the adults stopped listening. They said it was just a child's imagination. But Mila never forgot. She grew up carrying a weight on her chest, a longing that had no name. If you think all this is just a coincidence, get ready. Because what Mila discovered years later changed everything, and revealed a truth that had been buried for a long time. Like this video now and subscribe to the channel, because this true story will keep you hooked until the very last second. And the most impressive part is yet to come. As an adult, Mila decided to revisit the farm where she spent the first years of her life. A place full of silence and secrets. And it was there, among the tall grass and the dust of time, that she found the old well. The same one she had seen in her dreams. The same one that had haunted her since she was a child. At that moment, she had no doubts. She looked at that forgotten hole and said to herself, "I'm going to find out what happened, no matter what the cost." The silence around the well was almost sacred. Mila approached slowly, as if she were stepping into a forbidden place. The wind swayed the dry leaves on the ground, and the sound it made seemed like an ancient whisper, as if the place had something to say. She stood there for minutes, just staring. The well was covered with old boards, some broken, others rotten. It was as if someone had tried to hide what was inside, and perhaps they had succeeded for a long time. Mila took a deep breath. She knew that from that moment on, there would be no going back. The decision she was about to make could change everything, including the image she had of her own family. She returned home with a restless heart. For days, she could think of nothing else. The images from her dreams came back with force. The woman's scream, the push, the fall, the darkness. It was then that she decided to tell a childhood friend what she had found. Someone who knew that place, who remembered her childhood, the strange stories, the recurring nightmares. And to Mila's surprise, her friend didn't think it was crazy. "You always talk about that well when you were little, always," her friend said, looking her in the eyes. "And she always cried when she told them, as if she were feeling the pain of someone who had truly lost a mother." These words were like a push. Mila knew she could no longer ignore it. She knew that in order to find peace, she would have to face whatever was there. With the little money she had saved, she hired a small team to excavate the site. She said it was a personal, family matter. The man in charge of the work thought it was strange, but he didn't ask any questions. He just set a date. The night before the excavation, Mila could barely sleep. She kept staring at the ceiling, remembering the woman from her dreams. She wasn't screaming for help. She was screaming for justice. The day dawned gray. The sky seemed to carry the weight of years of silence. The team arrived early, bringing tools, ropes, flashlights. No one there had any idea what they would find. The work began slowly. The boards were carefully removed, revealing the deep darkness of the well. Mila watched every movement, her heart racing and her hands shaking. Hours passed until something strange happened. One of the men screamed. He had felt the ground give way. And there, under a layer of compacted earth, something appeared. A piece of fabric. Old. Torn. Muddy. But there, at the bottom of that well, something was about to be revealed. Something that would forever change Milla's story, and that of the woman of her dreams. And even before she knew the full truth, she already felt that she was about to meet someone who, somehow, had always been with her. The fabric, she found, seemed to have belonged to a dress. It was floral, or at least it had been one day. Time and earth had faded it almost completely, but still carried a strange delicacy. As if, even buried, it still cried out for attention. Milla approached, knelt at the edge of the well, and observed with teary eyes. That was not just an old cloth. It was a clue. A sign that everything she felt, everything she dreamed, had a real reason to exist. The team continued digging, now with more care. The soil was damp, dense, heavy, as if it resisted giving up what it had kept for so many years. But Milla didn't back down. She stood there motionless, following every inch they unearthed. And then something else appeared. First, a bracelet, small with white beads. Broken but unmistakable. Milla recognized it immediately. She had seen that bracelet before in her dreams. On the wrist of the woman who was falling. Milla's legs gave out. She had to sit down. This was too much. It was as if time was going back and stitching together the pieces of a story that everyone had refused to see. One of the workers looked at her and asked if she wanted to continue. The answer came firmly, even with a choked voice. Yes. Continue. Please. It was the first time she had asked for something with such certainty in her life. Minutes later, something even more shocking emerged. Bones. Human remains. They were there, mixed in with the earth, hidden like a dirty secret someone had tried to erase from the world. But there they were. Undeniable. Real. Milla brought her hands to her face. She began to cry softly. Not out of fear, but out of pain. A pain that came from a deep, ancient, almost ancestral place. It was as if part of her had been unearthed along with those bones. She couldn't explain how she knew, but she knew. That woman was her mother. The one she had never met. The one she dreamed about often. The one who screamed as she fell. The police were called. The place was cordoned off. The forensic team took everything for analysis, while Milla, sitting in the shade of a nearby tree, felt the world slowly spin around her. It was as if, finally, the truth had found space to breathe. During the following days, she could barely sleep. She relived every moment of the excavation, every detail, every discovery. But deep down, she felt a strange peace, a certainty that her mother was no longer lost. When the report confirmed that the bones belonged to a woman between 25 and 30 years old, everything began to fall into place. The DNA test was still pending, but Milla already knew the result. Inside her, there were no more doubts. The process would be long. The investigation was just beginning. But at that moment, the most important thing was that the voice of that woman, silenced for so many years, was finally beginning to be heard. Milla looked up at the sky at the end of that day. The wind blew gently, as if bringing an answer. She whispered, "I found you, and I will give you justice. I promise." And that promise would be the beginning of an even greater battle. Because what came next would reveal secrets that many wanted to keep buried forever. The silence in Milla's house that night was different. It was no longer the silence of doubt, but of waiting. A heavy weight, full of memories and questions that still had no answers. The face of the woman of her dreams came back with more clarity now, as if she were trying to think. She spent hours looking at old photos, documents, anything that could shed light on the past that had been stolen from her. For the first time, she realized that she knew almost nothing about her adoption. Everything was vague, with no clear records. Just signed papers and old stamps. Something was wrong. The more she looked, the more she noticed the gaps. Dates that didn't match. Incomplete information. People who no longer existed. As if someone had tried too hard to erase the real story. It was then that, rummaging through the bottom of a forgotten drawer, she found a yellowed envelope. Inside it, an old photo folded in half. It was a young woman smiling next to a baby. Mila felt the air leave her lungs. The woman was her. There was no doubt. And the baby, herself, in the arms of the person she now knew, was her mother. The back of the photo had delicate handwriting, Maura and Mila, spring 1997. Mila closed her eyes and felt the tears fall silently. She finally had a name. Maura. That was the name she heard in her dreams, but had never been able to pronounce when she woke up. The next day, she took the photo to the police station where the case was being handled. The police chief, who had been treating everything with a certain distance, looked at the image and remained silent for a few seconds. His expression changed. Based on that photo and the location of the remains, the police began searching for old missing person records. And it wasn't long before her name appeared in the dusty archives of a neighboring city. Maura Menezes, a woman who had been missing for almost 20 years, a single mother, last seen with a man who said he wanted to help with the child. When she saw her name printed on an old police report, Mila felt a mixture of anger and relief. Her mother had been forgotten, ignored, classified as just another missing person. But now the truth was coming to light. The investigation intensified. Questions began to pile up. Who was the man who approached Maura? Why was she never really looked for? And most frighteningly, who was behind Mila's adoption? The name of Reginaldo, Mila's adoptive father, appeared in the old records as a witness in the disappearance. A detail that, until then, had gone unnoticed. But now it took on a different meaning. Mila confronted her stepmother, who had always maintained a cold, distant demeanor. The woman stammered, tried to change the subject, but could not hide the fear in her eyes. It was clear that she knew more than she was saying, and perhaps long ago she had chosen silence out of convenience. Mila's pain grew with each discovery, but with it also came strength. A strength she did not know she had. The strength of someone who carries within them the echo of a life unjustly silenced. She began to write down everything she remembered. Every dream, every detail, every feeling. As if she were reconstructing, piece by piece, the story that had been denied to her. And with each line written, she felt that she was getting a little closer to Maura. The DNA report was finally ready, and the confirmation was like a bolt of lightning and in a cloudy sky. Yes, the bones were those of Maura Menezes. And yes, she was Mila's biological mother. The woman who had cried in silence for years now had a voice. Mila cried for hours. She cried with pain, longing, anger, love. Because even though she hadn't lived with her, she felt that Maura had been with her the whole time. And now, finally, the truth was beginning to shine through the shadows. Mila woke up early that morning with her face still damp from the tears of the night before. The DNA report in her hands seemed to weigh a ton, as if each letter confirmed not only a truth, but also a silent betrayal that had lasted her entire life. She looked at the name Maura Menezes in the report and felt a mixture of love and indignation. Love for finally knowing her origins. Indignation for everything having been hidden, stifled, distorted. What else had they kept silent? That same day, Mila gathered up the courage and went to Reginaldo's house. He greeted her with the same rehearsed smile as always, but now that smile was no longer deceiving. She went in without saying a word, sat down at the kitchen table, and placed the report on the wooden tabletop. Reginaldo turned pale when he saw the paper. He read one line, then another, and then tried to laugh. He said that it was a mistake, that there must have been some confusion, that DNA tests weren't that reliable. But his voice was shaking. His eyes avoided hers. Mila, firmly, asked why her mother was buried in a well. And for the first time, she saw Reginaldo lose control. He screamed, banged on the table, said that she had no idea what she was talking about. But deep down, Mila knew. His desperation was the confession she needed. She left the house in silence, without looking back. The police, who already suspected Reginaldo because of his involvement in dubious adoption processes, now had what they needed to act. Within a few days, he was summoned to give a statement. During the interrogation, Reginaldo contradicted himself several times. He said that he had met Maura on the street, after she was a childhood friend, after she had been a distant acquaintance. Each version seemed weaker than the last. The police station gathered Milla's adoption documents and discovered irregularities. Forged signatures, missing hospital records, no proof of consent from the biological mother. It all led to a disturbing conclusion. Maura had not given up her daughter. She had been taken by force. Milla followed each step with her heart racing. Each revelation was like reliving the abandonment, but at the same time, it was like finding parts of herself that had been lost. And as painful as it was, she knew she had to keep going. The press began to take an interest in the case. A young woman who had dreamed of her dead mother since childhood. A body found in a well. A man about to be unmasked. The headlines filled the local newspapers and began to spread. Milla gave a brief interview. She said only what was necessary. That she would never forget the face of the woman in her dreams. That she now knew her name. And that she would not rest until she had justice. Her words moved everyone who watched. Days later, the police arrested Reginaldo. The accusation was clear: murder of Maura Menezes, falsification of public documents, and kidnapping of a minor. Milla watched everything without looking away. He tried to look at her when he left handcuffed, but she kept her head held high. This time, she was the truth that he could not hide. After the arrest, Milla returned to the well site. She took white flowers and threw them into the opening. She remained there for a few minutes in silence. It was not just a ritual. It was a farewell, a request for forgiveness, a gesture of love for the woman who never abandoned her, even though she was torn from life. As she left the site, she felt the wind gently touch her face. As if it were a hug. As if Maura were there, finally at peace. Milla whispered to the sky, "Now I know who I am, and you will not be forgotten." After Reginaldo's arrest, the following days were strangely silent for Milla. It was as if the world outside was in motion, but inside her everything was suspended, in its own time. The pain was still there, but mixed with a kind of strength she had never felt before. She began to visit Maura's symbolic grave, lovingly built in the city cemetery. The remains were still undergoing forensic analysis, but Milla wanted to ensure that her mother had a dignified space, with flowers and a name engraved in stone. Maura Menezes, mother, woman, victim of silence. Little by little, people began to approach her. Women who had also lost children to illegal adoptions. Young people who grew up with doubts about their origins. Milla's case had touched something deep in the city, as if her truth had lit a light in many other darknesses. Milla decided that she could not let all that fade away with time. She opened a small support group with weekly meetings. At first there were 3 people, then 5. In 2 months, there were more than 20. Each one with a story marked by abandonment, lies, or injustice. She felt that the shared pain transformed into something different. It did not heal the wounds, but it gave them a purpose. And that somehow kept her going. It was as if Maura, even after her death, was still inspiring life. It was at one of these meetings that Milla had the idea for the foundation. She wanted more than just meetings and words. She wanted action, real support, protection for children and women at risk. The bureaucracy was tiring. The resources were scarce, but her will was greater than any obstacle. She named the institution Casa Maura. The name echoed with softness and power. It was a tribute, but also a promise. A promise that no mother would be forgotten. A promise that no daughter would grow up without knowing where she came from. Casa Maura began to offer psychological care, legal support, and temporary shelter. Volunteers came from all sides. Lawyers, teachers, social workers. All moved by the strength of that story that began with a childhood dream and ended with the revelation of a crime. Milla discovered that, by fighting for her mother, she ended up fighting for many others as well. And that gave her meaning. She still cried sometimes, especially when she heard Maura's name said out loud. But now, each tear also carried a small dose of hope. One night, she found an old notebook hidden among her childhood belongings. In it, there were drawings she didn't remember making. One of them was eerily symbolic, a woman in a white dress reaching out to a little girl, next to a blue circle that looked like a well. She held the notebook tightly and felt her throat tighten. Her childish mind had tried to scream when her adult voice didn't yet know how to speak. It was as if her entire body always knew the truth, even if the world around her denied it. That night, Milla lit a candle next to her bed, as she had done since she discovered her mother's identity. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer. She wasn't asking for more answers. She was asking for strength to carry on. She was asking for light for other silenced voices. She knew that justice had begun, but there was still much to be done. The system that allowed her mother to disappear and her to be raised in a lie was still standing. But now, at least, there was someone willing to confront it. And so Milla carried on, one day at a time, one story at a time, with her mother's name tattooed on her heart and the certainty that, no matter how deep the darkness, the truth would always find a way to emerge. Months had passed since the inauguration of Casa Mora, but Milla still felt a void that was difficult to fill. Despite the public recognition and the positive impact of the project, there were questions inside her that still echoed in the silence of the night. Who was Mora before everything? What was her story before she became a body inside a well? These doubts began to torment Milla silently, like a longing for something she never had. She knew her mother's name. She knew how she died. She knew she had been wronged. But she didn't know who she was when she smiled. She didn't know what kind of music she liked, what made her laugh, if she was afraid of thunder or dreamed of the sea. Determined to find out who the woman was behind the name, Milla decided to look for Mora's old neighbors and friends. She started by going to the address on the report, in a forgotten neighborhood in the city, where the houses still bore traces of the past. There she found a lady named Dona Leah, who greeted her with tears in her eyes as soon as she heard the name. Dona Leah said that Mora was a sweet woman, always concerned about others, but that she had lived in fear in recent years. She said that she had gotten pregnant very young, and that the child's father, none other than Reginaldo, had started to come around her house with threats when she refused to hand over her daughter. Milla felt the ground give way beneath her feet. Reginaldo had known her before the chance of the adoption. That man had planned everything. The lie did not start after the crime. It was cultivated, planned, measured in the smallest details from the beginning. That made the past seem even crueler. The lady also showed an old photo, yellowed by time. Mora was holding a baby dress in her hands and smiling with her eyes closed, as if she were daydreaming. In the background, there was a window with flowery curtains. It was an image of peace, and that's why it hurt so much. Milla went home with the photo on her chest. She slept with it next to her pillow, like someone sleeping next to a loved one. For the first time, she could imagine her mother truly alive. Not as a victim, but as a woman full of life, dreams, and fragility. In the following days, she gathered all the information she could, organizing it as if she were putting together a jigsaw puzzle of memories. It was during this process that she had a new idea, to turn it all into a documentary. Not to expose the pain, but to immortalize the story and prevent it from being forgotten. She sought out a local team and presented her project. Soon production began. Interviews, photos, recordings in places marked by memories. It was an intense process, sometimes painful, but also transformative. Each word spoken in front of the cameras was a seed of truth thrown into the world. During one of the recordings, Milla returned to the site of the well. For the first time since the discovery, she went down to the edge, looked firmly inside, and said out loud, "Mom, you have not been forgotten, and you will never be silenced again." The cameras recorded everything, but even if there had been no one there, she would have said it all the same. The documentary was released 3 months later. It received critical acclaim and caused a stir throughout the country. More than a denunciation, it was a tribute. More than a crime story, it was a story of unfinished love. And with each person who watched it, Mora's memory became a little more vivid. Milla began to be invited to lectures, interviews, and seminars on illegal adoptions and violence against women. Her pain had become a cause, and her voice, previously ignored as a child, was now heard by thousands. Even with all this, there were nights when she still woke up with a heavy heart. No matter what she did, there was an absence that could never be filled. But she had learned to live with this absence as part of herself. She would look up at the sky and say softly, as if in a ritual, "Mom, now I know you." And with this knowledge came the strength to continue, not only for herself, but for all the others who still waited to be heard. The days following the documentary's release were a whirlwind. The repercussions were so intense that Mila could barely process it all. Strangers sent her letters, messages, and even gifts, thanking her for having the courage to tell her story. With each word of support, she felt her mother's voice echo louder. But not all the feedback was positive. There were also those who tried to silence her again. Malicious comments, insinuations that she was taking advantage of the tragedy, that she had exaggerated. These criticisms didn't hurt her as much as before, but they still left their mark. The truth, she learned, bothers those who profit from silence. One Sunday morning, while organizing the foundation's files, Mila found a small box forgotten at the back of the closet. It was made of old wood with a rusty latch. When she opened it, she found scribbled papers, unsent letters, and an incomplete diary of Mora's, which had been collected along with the belongings found on the land. Her hands trembled as she touched the pages. It was as if she were finally hearing her mother's voice in the first person. The words were simple but full of feeling. Mora spoke of her constant fear, her loneliness, and the immense love she felt for a daughter who had not yet been born. It was like diving into a memory that was not hers, but that lived inside her. On one of the pages, Mora wrote that she dreamed of opening a small cafe. She wanted it to be a welcoming place where mothers and children could spend time together, read, talk. She said that she had always believed in the power of simple encounters, of the smell of coffee mixed with the laughter of children. Mila cried silently. That idea, so simple, seemed to pulse in her heart. As if Mora were asking, through time, that dream not die with her. And for the first time since discovering the whole truth, Mila felt a new desire arise within her, to continue what her mother had begun to imagine. Without telling anyone, she began to look for available places. She wanted a small space with large windows and trees all around. After weeks of searching, she found an old, abandoned house with peeling walls and a wooden floor that creaked underfoot. But there she saw beauty. She saw a future. With the help of friends, volunteers, and part of the funds that came from the documentary, Mila began the renovation. Every detail was carefully thought out. The walls were painted in light tones, shelves of children's books occupied the sides, and in the center, wooden tables where mothers and children could sit together, share stories, and remember that there was still room for hope. The name was already decided from the very first moment, Café Mora, a silent and profound tribute. It was not just a business. It was a space for healing, for memory, for a new beginning. A place where the past was not forgotten, but transformed into something that could warm hearts. On the day of the opening, Mila stood at the door for a few seconds before opening it. She took a deep breath and remembered her mother's smile in the photo, holding that baby dress. Then she smiled back, as if she were responding to that gesture, even so many years later. People began to arrive little by little. Children running between the tables, mothers with teary eyes, lonely readers finding shelter in the pages of books. There was soft music in the background, and the aroma of fresh coffee filled the air. It was exactly as Mora had dreamed. Mila walked among the visitors, welcoming each one with a gentle look. She felt whole for the first time. The past had not disappeared, but now it was part of something bigger, something that could be touched, lived, shared. In the afternoon, she went up to the small improvised stage and gave a short speech. She didn't read anything. She spoke from the heart. She said that this space was the result of a pain that refused to be silenced, and that, even though she had never known her mother in life, she now felt that she knew her more than ever. The audience gave a standing ovation, and amidst the applause, Mila looked up as if searching for a sign. And at that moment, amidst the simplicity of a cafe, she understood that her journey was just beginning. Because love, when it is true, continues to live on in everything we leave behind. Cafe Mora quickly became more than just a welcoming place. It became a symbol. It was featured in local newspapers, mentioned in magazines, and became a reference for affection in a city marked by so many forgotten stories. But for Mila, the most important thing was what happened away from the cameras, in the small details, in the glances exchanged between mothers and children, in the comfortable silence between the pages of children's books. One day, while she was organizing the books on one of the shelves, a little girl approached with curious eyes. She was about 7 years old, with her hair tied in 2 braids and a look that was too melancholic for her age. She sat down at one of the tables, opened a book, but didn't read. She just looked at the cover, as if searching for something. Mila approached her slowly, not wanting to scare her. She sat down next to her and asked if she liked stories. The girl didn't answer right away. She just looked up and said, "Only if it's a true story, because lies are tiring." That hit Mila like a whisper from her own past. She recognized that pain disguised as maturity. The girl's mother was called Lucienne. She was young, visibly tired, and thanked Mila for the space, saying that her daughter had been through difficult times. She had lost her father tragically and hadn't spoken much since then. The cafe had been the first place in months where she had asked to return. That night, Mila couldn't sleep. She thought about the girl, about what she had said, and about how many other children like her were out there, invisible, carrying pain that no one saw. She felt a strong calling within herself. It was as if her mother's story, even after everything, was still teaching her. The next day, she had an idea. She would create a project within the cafe. A small circle of real stories where children could listen and, if they wanted, tell them too. Nothing forced. Everything in each person's own time. Stories that heal. Stories that welcome. She called a psychologist friend to help with the structure. In a few days, the Little Voices project took shape. Every Saturday, children would meet with volunteers to listen to true stories told with delicacy, and little by little, some of them began to tell their own. With fear, with tears, but also with relief. Mila watched everything from afar, respecting the space and time of each child. But she felt that this place was fulfilling a role that went beyond her personal dream. It was as if there, pieces of her past were being healed through other childhoods. The girl with braids, named Elisa, began to attend every Saturday. Little by little, she began to smile more, ask more questions, and really read. One day, she asked to tell a story. She went up on the small improvised stage, and with a trembling voice, spoke about missing her father and the silences he left behind. Everyone listened attentively, respecting each pause. When she finished, Elisa came down and hugged Mila without saying anything. That hug carried more than words. It was a kind of silent gratitude, as if to say, "Thank you for giving me a place where my pain has space." That night, Mila sat alone in the cafe after everyone had left. She looked around. The tables, the books, the toys in the corner. Everything there told a story. And even though her mother was not physically in that space, Mila felt her presence in every gesture of care. She picked up Mora's diary once more. She read a page where she said that words save when they are said with love. She closed her eyes and felt a rare peace. The cafe, the project, all of it was exactly that. A space where words said with love were saving not only her, but so many other wounded souls. In the days that followed, new children arrived, new stories began. And in each one of them, Mila saw reflections of her own journey. Because when truth finds space to flourish, it transforms what was once pain into healing. Mila's past would never be forgotten. But now it had become a bridge to new beginnings. And each child who entered that cafe was a new blank page. A new chance to write a different future. Time passed and Cafe Mora became a beacon for many families. What was once just a welcoming space was now also a place of transformation. Mila, still young, had become a reference in her community. But with recognition came new responsibilities. She knew she needed to keep the essence of it all alive, without allowing popularity to transform what was, above all, a refuge of affection. On a rainy Friday afternoon, a woman entered the cafe for the first time. She was wet, with a lost look in her eyes, and was holding a leather briefcase against her chest. Milla welcomed her with a calm smile, offering a blanket and a hot cup of tea. The woman thanked her, but seemed hesitant, as if fighting against something inside herself. After a few minutes of silence, she approached the bookshelf and took out an old book, worn at the edges. She sat down near the window and stayed there without opening the book, just watching the rain. Milla, accustomed to the deep silences of those who carry secrets, did not insist. She respected the space, but remained attentive. Before leaving, the lady approached again. She said her name was Dolores, and that she had heard about the place from a news story on television. With a trembling voice, she revealed that more than 30 years ago she had lost her newborn daughter, taken by people who promised help. She never saw her again. She never got any answers. Milla's heart raced. There was something in that story that touched a dormant part of her. Dolores held the folder tightly, as if it were her only anchor. She asked to leave it there, saying that she no longer had the strength to look for it, but that perhaps someone would know what to do with those papers. Milla accepted, but did not immediately understand the reason for that gesture. As soon as the lady left, Milla opened the folder. Inside were old photos, birth certificates, undelivered letters, and a faded diary. Each page told the story of a mother who struggled with silence. As she read, Milla felt a tightness in her chest. Dolores' words seemed to be written with the same desperation that she once imagined had come from her own mother. In the days that followed, Milla couldn't stop thinking about Dolores. She read the contents of the folder again, and something caught her attention. A familiar name appeared among the documents. A name she never imagined she would see again. Reginaldo. It was there among the papers, linked to an old illegal adoption case. It was as if the ground had opened up beneath her feet. She thought she knew the whole truth, but this new detail showed that there might be even more behind her mother's disappearance. Could it be that Dolores was somehow connected to her story too? Moved by growing anguish, Milla sought out the lady again. She went to the address she had left in the cafe's registry, but the place was empty. The house was abandoned, its windows covered in dust. The neighbors said that Dolores had left days before, saying she wouldn't be back. It was as if she had left the past there, waiting for someone to finally face it. Milla returned to the cafe, and that night, she sat alone with the diary in her hands. She read and reread Dolores's words, trying to fit together the loose pieces of a story that seemed to be intertwined with her own. She felt confused but determined. If there was one thing she had learned over the years, it was that the truth always finds a way to emerge. The next day, she sought out the journalist who had written the story about Café Mora. She showed her the documents, shared her suspicions, and together they decided to investigate. They began to cross-reference dates, names, documents. Each discovery raised more questions than answers. That was how Milla discovered that Reginaldo had been part of a larger network, a silent and long-standing scheme of illegal adoptions that involve hospitals, judges, and desperate families. And somehow, Dolores had been one of the victims of this cruel system. The pain returned like a reopened wound. But now she was not alone. She had a voice, she had support, and more than that, she had a purpose. It was no longer just her story, but so many others that had been buried along with the silence. Milla decided that she would not let this go unnoticed. And it was at that moment that she understood. Her path was just beginning. Because pain, when shared, transforms. And the truth, even when hidden for decades, always finds an echo in hearts willing to listen. The nights were long again. Milla spent hours awake, organizing documents, recording audios for the journalist, and trying to understand the size of the web that surrounded Reginaldo's name. What seemed to be just an isolated crime now turned out to be part of a sick, cruel, and extremely well-covered system. The cafe continued to operate normally, but inside, Milla felt shaken. Each new piece of information was like a blade that reopened wounds. But now she could not back down. She had chosen to shed light on what had remained in the shadows for years. And that required courage, even if fear tried to speak louder. The journalist, whose name was Teresa, brought previously unpublished documents. She discovered through an anonymous source that Reginaldo had falsified at least 7 birth certificates over the years. Children disappeared from the records, mothers were silenced, and no one paid for it. Until now. One of these children, according to the records, disappeared in a hospital in the countryside the same year that Milla had been adopted. The coincidences were too disturbing to ignore. Teresa suggested that Milla redo all the possible DNA tests, cross-referencing them with the mothers registered in that same hospital. And among the names was Dolores. Milla's heart beat faster. Could it be possible? Dolores was not just a victim, but her real grandmother? It all seemed too surreal, but her instincts told her that she was getting closer and closer to something huge. Something that would change everything again. They were weeks of waiting. Each day was a mix of anxiety, hope, and fear. Milla avoided telling other people. She wanted to be sure before allowing her emotions to take over. But the silence weighed heavily. Carrying everything alone again reminded her of the girl who believed she was making up memories. Then the results came. Dolores Meneses was, in fact, Milla's biological grandmother. The proof that Mora was her daughter, and that for some reason that was still unclear, she had been taken away from her family. Milla didn't know whether to cry with sadness or relief. It was like finding a piece of herself that had always been hidden, waiting for a sign. The first reaction was to look for Dolores, but she was still missing. Teresa reported the case to the press, and the story spread. The story of Milla and Dolores began to move the country. People began sending information, old photos, possible locations. It was as if everyone, for a moment, wanted to help rebuild what had been destroyed. At the cafe, the movement grew even more. Children and mothers came from far away, attracted not only by the welcoming space, but by the story that was now gaining national repercussion. Many said that, when they heard about Milla, they remembered their own losses, their own silences. Milla began to organize meetings at the cafe, not only for reading, but for listening. Deep listening. Meetings where mothers told their stories, and where children who grew up far from their origins had the chance to search for answers. It was a painful but extremely necessary process. And it was during one of these meetings that a woman introduced herself. She was fragile, with tears in her eyes and a low voice. It was Dolores. She had seen the article, but she was afraid to look for Milla. She thought it was too late, that her absence would be a burden, not a reunion. Milla stood up slowly. She looked into the eyes of that woman who, without knowing it, had fought for her entire life. There was no speech, just a long, tight, silent hug. The two cried together without words. Because sometimes love only needs presence. Dolores told everything. How Mora had been taken away from her when she was young. How Reginaldo had approached the family with false promises. And how, since then, she had lived with guilt and absence. Milla listened to everything with an open heart, feeling each word as a reunion with her own origin. That night, Café Mora did not close. The lights stayed on, people remained silent, listening to that story that now had a new chapter. The chapter where 2 generations separated by pain were reunited through the power of truth. The next morning, the sun seemed to rise differently. For the first time in many years, Milla woke up with a strange feeling of lightness. There was still a lot of pain, many unanswered questions, but something inside her seemed to finally rest. Having Dolores there, even if belatedly, was like reconnecting with a forgotten part of her soul. Dolores started going to Café Mora every day. She arrived early, helped organize the books, made simple cakes, and sat with the children to read stories. It was as if she was making up for lost time with her daughter through every gesture she made with her granddaughter. Milla, in turn, felt even more determined. She began to formally record the stories of other families who had gone through similar situations. She set up a small support center in the back of the cafe, with volunteer psychologists and lawyers willing to help. Her pain was now channeled into action. But the system she was fighting against did not remain silent. People began to appear, warning Milla to be careful, that she was messing with old things, with dangerous people. They tried to intimidate her with anonymous messages, with false documents, trying to discredit her. But was too late for fear. Teresa, the journalist, also received threats. But she responded with even more investigative rigor. The story they had published was only the beginning. Now they were about to launch a series of special reports revealing the network of illegal adoptions that had operated in silence for decades, with Reginaldo's name appearing in several connections. Meanwhile, Dolores opened an old box of memories in her house and gave Milla something she had kept for years, a letter from Mora, written shortly before she disappeared. In it, Mora said that if anything happened to her, she hoped that one day her daughter would find out the truth, and that she would never stop loving her, no matter where she was. When she read those words, Milla felt as if Mora were there, present among them. Dolores hugged her tightly. Two women from different generations, united by an absence, but now connected by truth. It was a silent moment, but full of meaning. At Café Mora, the patrons seemed to realize that something had changed. There was more warmth, more humanity in their eyes. Children began writing notes to Milla, thanking her for creating a space where they could dream without fear. It was as if each story that was rescued there had the power to heal much greater wounds. One day, a young woman came into the cafe and introduced herself as a social worker. She said she worked at a local shelter and that many of the children there came from homes that had been destroyed by lies and neglect. She asked if she could take some of them to see the space, to hear their stories, to perhaps find some peace. Milla smiled. She said that was the purpose of everything. Not just to tell her own story, but to allow other voices to be heard. They scheduled a visit for the following Saturday. And that day, Café Mora came to life more than ever. The children arrived with curious eyes and closed hearts. But all it took was a warm cake, a well-told story, and a hug from Dolores for them to start opening up. Milla watched them with a heavy heart. In each face, she saw a part of herself. A childhood interrupted, but with a chance to start over. And that was when Milla had an idea. Something bigger, deeper. A project that could spread to other cities, other states. A chain of cafes like that, in the name of women who never had a voice, of children who were still waiting for a real home. When Dolores heard the idea, she held her granddaughter's hand and said that Mora would be proud. That all that pain had not been in vain. That perhaps the greatest gesture of love would be to transform suffering into care, into presence, into building new paths. That night, Milla wrote the first page of the Raízes Vivas project, a national program of support, memory, and reconstruction of family ties. And it all started with a phrase that had echoed inside her since she was a child. The voice that no one believed, the memory of a well, and the love that, even buried, never stopped blooming. The Raízes Vivas project grew silently, like the roots of a tree that expand underground before sprouting into the world. Milla was involved in every detail, the texts, the contacts, the expansion plans. It was no longer just about her story, but about so many others that had never been told. She wanted each cafe to be a seed of hope in a soil that had long been dry of love. The first step was to transform Café Mora into an official headquarters. A discreet sign was placed at the entrance. Here begins what was once buried, but never forgotten. People stopped to read it and often cried, because they understood, because they recognized in those words the pain of their own stories. Teresa, the journalist, continued to be by Milla's side. Now, not only as an investigator, but as a friend. Together, they created an archive with more than 80 stories from people who believed they had been through irregular adoptions. Each case was analyzed carefully. The pain of one was no less than that of another. Dolores, even at her advanced age, made a point of attending the meetings. Her presence brought comfort, like the embrace of someone who has lost someone and still chose to love. The children called her Grandma Lors and sat around her as if she were a port in the middle of a storm. But not everything was bright. One night, when Milla was leaving the cafe, she found her car with flat tires and a note stuck to the windshield. you're going too far. Stop before you run out of time. She stood there for a few seconds, breathing deeply, trying to control her fear. She knew that this was yet another warning. But backing down was no longer an option. The next day, Milla went to the police station to file a report. The officer listened to her seriously, but his expression was cautious. He said that these types of threats don't always lead to anything, but they shouldn't be ignored either, and that she should increase her security. Milla didn't say anything to Dolores. She didn't want to worry her, but she began to go to and from the cafe accompanied by a trusted friend. Teresa also redoubled her caution. They both knew that they were touching on deep wounds, and that some people would do anything to keep certain secrets buried. Even so, the days went by. The cafe increasingly became a space for healing. Children who had previously been silent began to draw what they remembered from their origins. Some mothers found the strength to tell what they had been forced to hide for years. The truth was a wound, but it was also a medicine. It was then that something unexpected happened. An anonymous letter arrived at the cafe. The envelope was simple, with no sender, just Milla's name handwritten. Inside a single sentence, Mora knew more than she should have. That's why she had to disappear. The paper was yellowed, as if it had been written many years ago. Milla stood still, reading and rereading those words. Something inside her stirred. Even though she already knew about Reginaldo's cruelty, this suggested that her mother had discovered something bigger. Something that perhaps hadn't yet come to light. Teresa analyzed the letter. The handwriting was written by someone elderly. The paper seemed to come from an old notebook. It was impossible to trace its origin, but the content was clear. Mora wasn't just the victim of an impulsive act. She was silenced, eliminated for knowing too much. This possibility made Milla dive back into the archives. She searched through old reports and interviewed people who had lived with Reginaldo during the years he worked as a social agent. Most were afraid to speak. Some cried when they remembered. Others just lowered their heads and said she was too good for this world. During one of these searches, she found a woman named Surley, now almost 80 years old. She had worked as a receptionist at the old clinic where Reginaldo worked. When she heard the name Mora, her eyes filled with tears. She said she remembered her well, that she would show up there often, and that one day, she simply never came back. Surley revealed something even more shocking. According to her, Mora was trying to expose a scheme involving doctors, judges, and local churches. A cycle where children were forcibly taken from poor mothers under the pretext of abandonment and then given to influential families. All with forged documents. All with the appearance of legality. Milla's heart raced. Now she knew that the well where her mother was buried did not just hide a body. It hid truths that many were willing to kill to keep buried. But she would not rest. Not now, because Mora was not just her mother. She was a woman who tried to fight, and who, even in death, still guided her. The silence that night was different. It was not the calm silence of someone resting, but the tense silence of someone who knows that something is about to be revealed. Milla spent hours staring at the wall of her room with the anonymous letter between her fingers. She knew that this changed everything. Her mother did not just disappear. She was erased, and perhaps there were still people willing to repeat the story. The next day, Milla went to visit Surley again. She needed more answers. The old woman greeted her with a tired but welcoming look. Her trembling hands gripped hers tightly. "You look like her," she said, looking deep into Milla's eyes. The same strength. The same look of someone who doesn't give up. They sat at the kitchen table, where the smell of freshly brewed coffee seemed to resist the passage of time. Surley opened a wooden box where she kept old notebooks, diaries with notes, newspaper clippings. She said she had never had the courage to throw them away. There are stories here that no one wanted to hear. But maybe now is the time. On one of the pages, Milla found something that took her breath away. The name of her mother, Mora Meneses, next to dates, times, and names of doctors and judges. That notebook was an informal but meticulous record. Surley explained each note with a choked voice. She came here after every visit. She said she needed to record everything. She was afraid of forgetting. There were names there that were already dead, but others were still alive. Men who, over the years, had held important positions in the city. Many of them still had political influence. Milla felt her stomach churn. The network was bigger than she had imagined, and her mother's story was not an isolated case. It was part of something systematic. On the way home, Milla called Teresa. They arranged an emergency meeting at the cafe after hours. They spread the documents out on the table in the back, away from prying eyes. The journalist recorded everything, made digital copies, and wrote down every detail. She knew that now they had something too big to keep quiet. This could cause a national scandal, Teresa said seriously. But it could also put you in real danger. Milla just nodded. The fear was there, of course. But now it was less than the weight of the truth. If my mother had the courage to face this alone, I can too. But this time I'm not alone. They decided that the best way to proceed would be strategic. They would create a special report with evidence, testimonies, and historical context. They would release everything at once, so that it could not be ignored or hushed up. And before that, they would hold meetings with human rights organizations and trusted prosecutors. The next morning, the cafe was full of children laughing, reading, and eating cake. But in Milla's heart, there was a volcano ready to explode. Dolores, who saw everything with the eyes of someone who had lived too much, pulled her aside. "You have to tell me what's happening. Don't hide it from me." And Milla told her everything. Dolores listened in silence, pursing her lips. When her granddaughter finished, she simply said, "Then do it. But do it right. Do it with justice, not with anger. Because if you do it with anger, you will lose yourself. But if you do it with love, you will change the world." Her grandmother's words echoed in Milla's mind for days. It wouldn't be easy, but she knew she had already crossed the line of return. This was now bigger than her pain. It was about a system that needed to be exposed, and about giving a voice to those who had been silenced. That week, the first meeting with a child protection NGO was scheduled. Milla brought the documents, the testimonies, and told her story with contained tears. Across the table, a lawyer said, "You can't imagine how many similar stories we've heard, but you have something that few have. Evidence." That sentence was like a trigger. Milla didn't sleep that night. At dawn, she recorded a video with her own voice where she told part of her story. She didn't show faces, she didn't use names yet. But she made a direct appeal. If you've been through something similar, if you feel like part of your life was stolen, speak up. Write to me. Your story matters. The video went viral in a few hours. Hundreds of comments, thousands of views, messages from people all over the country, sharing stories, memories, fears. It was with opening a dam. And Milla knew what was coming next would be even more intense, but also more true. And there, faced with that avalanche of previously silent voices, Milla felt it. What had started with a girl saying that her mother was at the bottom of a well was now the cry of hundreds wanting to escape the darkness. The cafe where it all began now seemed like a sanctuary. The children continued to arrive with colorful backpacks and curious eyes. But there, among children's books and the smell of cake in the oven, something bigger was being born. Milla looked around and felt her heart beat fast. It was as if her mother were there, watching everything. As if each child's laugh was a whisper saying, "You did." The video had surpassed 1 million views in less than 3 days. It was shared in groups, news articles, podcasts. And with it came hundreds of stories. Some frightening, others sad, all real. They were voices like Mora's, which had been silenced for years, and which now found an echo in Milla. Teresa, with tears in her eyes, entered the back room holding the draft of the final report. "It's ready," she said, with a mixture of relief and tension. It was a long, detailed document with evidence, names, dates, and testimonies. When this airs, there's no going back. Are you ready? Milla didn't hesitate. She was. Days later, the story was published on national television. In a short time, it became the most talked about topic in the country. Entire cities stopped to watch the interviews, Mila's videos, the courageous complaints of other victims. The authorities could not ignore it. Investigations were opened. People were arrested. Documents were seized. Reginaldo, the man who stole her childhood, was already behind bars. But now, so many others like him were beginning to fall. Mila didn't feel pleasure in this. She felt relief. Justice. It was as if each act of hers had pushed a stone out of someone's path. And finally the path was opening up for other girls, other mothers, other Milas. The Mora Manessa's foundation grew. It gained support, it gained a voice. Psychologists, social workers, volunteers. The small room became a community center. Then it became an institute. And finally, it was recognized as one of the main social projects in the country.